There is a people that does not fit on the map. Not the geographical one, but the historical one. They live at the junction of two states, between the mountains and the ocean, and speak a language that is unlike anything else in Europe. For centuries, scientists have tried to explain their existence. Every generation found its own answer, and each of these answers turned out to be insufficient. They are called the Basques. And the strangest thing about them is not what we know about them, but what we still do not know. For generations, the history seemed settled, clean, convenient, almost too simple. It is said that the Basques are the last Europeans, a remnant of something very ancient that disappeared everywhere else but survived in the folds of the Pyrenees, a living relic, a fossil of language and blood. This is how 19th-century ethnographers described them, and how 20th-century textbooks depicted them. A people outside of time, a people without a history, because their history supposedly ended even before the history of everyone else began. This idea was beautiful, and that is exactly why it was believed for so long. But then evidence appeared, and the old explanatory model began to crack. To understand what happened, one must return to the very beginning, to before the word Basque appeared, to before borders were drawn, to before anyone even wondered where the people in this corner of Europe came from. The Basques live in a territory that stretches from the northern coast of Spain to the southwest of France. Their land is called Euskal Herria. Their language is Euskara, and it does not belong to any known language family. Not Indo-European, not Semitic, not Uralic, just different, on its own. For linguists, this was a riddle that defied solution. No language in Europe showed any kinship with it. No language in North Africa. No language in the Caucasus, even though attempts were made to draw parallels. Euskara stood apart, like a lone monument in a field. And that is exactly why the most popular theory was born. If the language is so old and so isolated, it means its speakers are the descendants of the first Europeans, those who came here back in the Paleolithic, before the Indo-Europeans appeared, before the Neolithic brought agriculture from the Middle East, before the Bronze Age changed everything. The Basques, scientists said, are the people of the Lascaux caves. They are the people of mammoths and reindeer. They are the face that Europe had before it became Europe. This idea seemed elegant. There was poetry in it. Mountains hide what plains lose. The ocean guards what the mainland forgets. And the Basques, locked between the mountains and the sea, supposedly preserved within themselves a past that had disappeared everywhere else. Early genetic studies also supported this theory. In the mid-20th century, scientists paid attention to blood groups. It turned out that among the Basques, there's an unusually high percentage of people with an Rh negative factor, higher than in any other people in Europe. This seemed to be proof that they are genetically different from their neighbors, that they are a separate population, that they are truly different. Thus was born the picture that prevailed for decades. The Basques are a living relic, the last true Europeans, a people who survived all waves of migrations, all invasions, all mixings, an island in the sea of history. For many, this idea was not just scientific, it became a part of their self-awareness. To be Basque meant to carry within oneself something very ancient, something that preceded everything, something that no one else in Europe had anymore. But there was always one problem, one detail that did not fit. If the Basques are Paleolithic relics, then why are their culture, their material heritage, and their burials so similar to the culture of their neighbors? Why did their agricultural traditions develop in parallel with others? Why did their genes, even according to those early studies, have so much in common with the people of Iberia and southern France? At first, this seemed like an exception, a local anomaly, a minor fact that could be explained by random contacts. But then the evidence began to accumulate. And then happened what happened to many old theories of the 20th century. A new technology arrived, and the old history began to splinter. At the beginning of the 21st century, genetics made a great leap. Scientists learned to read the DNA not only of living people, but also of those who died thousands of years ago. Paleogenomics emerged, a science that allows extracting genetic material from old bones and teeth, sequencing it, and comparing it with the genomes of modern populations. And suddenly the past ceased to be silent. Researchers began to open burial mounds, caves, and ancient tombs all over Europe. They took samples, analyzed them, built maps of migrations that no one had ever seen before. And what they found changed everything. Europe, it turned out, was not static. It was an arena of constant movements. Wave after wave of people came here from different directions. The first hunters and gatherers from Africa, then farmers from Anatolia who brought the Neolithic, then pastoralists from the steppes east of the Black Sea who arrived in the Bronze Age and changed the genetic landscape of the continent almost completely. Each of these waves left a mark, each mixed with the previous one. And in most regions of Europe, the final result was similar. Modern Europeans are a mixture of these three main components in various proportions. But what about the Basques? Here began the most interesting part. Because the DNA analysis of modern Basques and ancient bones from their territory showed something unexpected. The Basques turned out not to be Paleolithic relics. They turned out to be something else. Something no less strange, but completely different from what was previously thought. Their genetic profile showed that they are the descendants of Neolithic farmers who came from Anatolia approximately 7,000 years ago. That is, they are no older than other Europeans. They, in a sense, arrived later than those Paleolithic hunters with whom they were associated. But then it got even more interesting. Because although the Neolithic component in them is very strong, the steppe component, which in other Europeans almost erased the previous layers, remained at a very low level among the Basques. In other words, that great migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which brought Indo-European languages almost everywhere in Europe, affected the Basques much less. They did not avoid it completely. There are traces, but they are much smaller than in any other people of Western Europe. And this, it seems, explains why their language was preserved. Not because it is incredibly ancient in the Paleolithic sense, but because the new wave that brought Indo-European languages, in their case, could not completely replace the previous linguistic reality. The data did not simplify the past. They made it older, but at the same time different, not as we expected. The old theory was not completely wrong, it was incomplete. The Basques truly preserved something very rare. But this something is not a Paleolithic heritage. It is a Neolithic heritage that in most of Europe was covered by subsequent waves, but survived in the Pyrenees. They are not the last hunters of the Stone Age. They are the last representatives of the first great agricultural culture that once settled Europe. And this discovery changed everything. Because if the Basques are the descendants of Anatolian farmers, then their language probably also has roots there, in that ancient linguistic reality that prevailed in Europe before the arrival of Indo-European languages. In that forgotten world, where people spoke languages of which almost nothing remains today. Euskara is perhaps the only living fragment of this world, the last echo of the languages spoken by Europe 7,000 years ago. A voice that should have fallen silent, but did not. Here the story should have become simpler, but it became deeper. Because when scientists began to compare the DNA of modern Basques with the DNA of ancient skeletons found in different layers of time on their territory, It turned out that the picture was not so unambiguous. In some studies, it was evident that genetic continuity had been preserved for millennia, that the people who lived in the Pyrenees in the Bronze Age are very similar to modern Basques. This confirmed the idea of deep continuity. In other studies, signals of partial mixing appeared, small infusions of new blood, traces of contacts with the outside world. Small, but noticeable. It turned out that the Basques were not completely isolated. They did not live in a glass jar. They contacted their neighbors, traded, and sometimes intermarried. But somehow their core genetic and linguistic identity endured. This gave rise to a new question. Why? Why exactly here, in this specific corner of Europe, did the previous world survive and not disappear as it disappeared everywhere else? There was no single answer. There were several hypotheses, and each of them explained a part of the picture, but none explained everything. The first hypothesis pointed to geography. The Pyrenees are a barrier, mountains that delay migrations, valleys that create closed communities, the ocean that restricts movement from the west. Perhaps it was the terrain that preserved the Basques. The second hypothesis pointed to social structure. Perhaps Basque communities had traditions that complicated assimilation, strong family ties, peculiar marriage rules, cultural resilience that was passed down from generation to generation. The third hypothesis, the most interesting one, pointed to time. Perhaps the steppe wave simply arrived here later and weaker. Perhaps by the time it reached the Pyrenees, its strength had already faded, and local communities were able to integrate the newcomers without losing themselves. None of these hypotheses was complete. Together they created a mosaic, and what emerged from this mosaic was not a simple answer, but a complex picture. The Basques are not a relic, not an exception, not a museum exhibit of nature. They are an example of how identity can survive amidst waves that change everything around. And now for the biggest twist. Because in one of the most detailed genetic studies of recent years, it turned out that the Basques actually formed as a separate population not as long ago as thought. Their genetic difference from their neighbors became noticeable approximately in the Iron Age, that is, about 3,000 years ago. Before that, they did not differ much from other inhabitants of Iberia. But then something happened. Some process, some event, some change in the social structure or in the nature of contacts with the world. And their population began to keep its distance, to mix less, to accept fewer newcomers, to preserve their language, their customs, their blood. In other words, Basque identity is not an eternal legacy of the Paleolithic. It is a historical phenomenon, something that formed at a specific moment and was maintained thanks to specific circumstances. This discovery was quiet but powerful. It overturned the idea of what it means to be an ancient people. Because antiquity is not only about origins, it is also about choice, about how a community decides to preserve itself. Let us now imagine for a minute one of the landscapes that perhaps those who became the ancestors of modern Basques saw. A valley in the Pyrenees. Early morning, fog rises from the grass, lies on the stones, and slowly melts under the first rays of the sun. The mountains around are dark, wet, and silent. Somewhere deep in the forest, water can be heard, a stream making its way among roots and moss. A small settlement is visible on the slope, stone walls, smoke above the roofs, a flock of sheep led by someone in a rough cloak. Voices can be heard, and the language of these voices is unlike anything that sounds today. It is older than Latin, older than the Gallic dialects, older than anything people will later bring here. These people do not know that they hold something unique in their mouths. They simply live. They graze sheep, catch fish, cultivate the field. They pass on to their children the words they heard from their parents. And so, day after day, year after year, generation after generation, They carry through time what no one else carries. The mountains protect them, but the mountains would not have saved them if they themselves had not decided to preserve. And this is perhaps the most important lesson of this story, because language is not preserved by chance. Blood is not preserved by chance. Identity is not preserved by chance. Someone must pass it on. Someone must believe that it is worth passing on. 7,000 years. That is how much time has passed since the moment the first farmers from Anatolia reached the Pyrenees. For 7,000 years, people here spoke the language that became Euskara. For 7,000 years, they were a link in a chain that never once broke. No dynasty has lasted so long, no empire, no religion in an unchanged form. But this language has lasted. And yet even this is not the whole truth, because the Basques, as genetics has shown, are not pure descendants of those Anatolian farmers. They also have Paleolithic components, a small but present admixture of the steppe. Traces of contacts with the Celts, Romans, Goths, Moors, with everyone who passed through Iberia. They are not pure. No one is pure. Purity does not exist in human history. They are a synthesis, an alloy that has held its shape longer than others. And this is exactly what makes their history so valuable, not because they are unique in their origin, but because they show how continuity works, not as a stone monolith, but as a river that changes its water but does not change its course. Why do we want to believe in simple origin stories so much? Perhaps because there is comfort in simplicity. If we know where we came from, we know who we are. If we can draw a straight line from ourselves to some ancient ancestor, we feel that we belong to something greater, that we are not just random points in time. But evidence almost always resists such lines. It shows that the past is not a tree with a single root, but a forest in which roots are intertwined, intersect, and feed each other. That no nation comes from a single source. That we are all the result of thousands of mixings, millions of encounters, countless choices made by people whose names we will never know. The Basques remind us of this with particular force, because their history seemed so simple. The last Europeans, a living relic, a pure fragment of antiquity. And it turned out to be so complex. Layers upon layers, waves upon waves, an identity that was formed not once, but many times, in response to different challenges in different eras. What we call the Basques is not one thing, it is a process, a long, slow, never-ending process of self-preservation. And when we understand this, we begin to look differently at other peoples, at ourselves, at our own family history. Because if an identity as ancient and as enduring as the Basque one turned out to be so multi-layered, then what can be said about everyone else? Each of us is a sum, not of one ancestor, but of thousands. Not of one migration, but of many. Not of one blood, but of a mixture that traveled through centuries, crossed borders, changed names, forgot and remembered itself. The history of the Basques is the history of us all, only told more slowly, with greater patience, with greater clarity of signal. And in this lies its true value. What remains of all this? What do we now know about the Basques that we did not know before? We know that they are not Paleolithic relics, that their roots go back to the Neolithic migration from Anatolia, that their distinctiveness as a people was formed in the Iron Age, that their language is probably the last living echo of the linguistic world that prevailed in Europe before the arrival of Indo-European languages, that they preserved themselves not through complete isolation, but through a certain balance between contact and distance. We know all this, and we still do not know many things. We do not know exactly why the Iron Age became the turning point. We do not know what social decisions those ancient communities made to preserve their language when everyone around them was switching to others. We do not know if there were moments in the history of the Basques when everything could have been cut short, epidemics, wars, famine, and why these moments did not cut it short. We do not know what other secrets are hidden in their ancient burials, in their caves, in those skeletons that have not yet been found. Perhaps in 10 years, new data will appear that will change the picture again. Perhaps it will turn out that there is a component in the Basques that we do not suspect today. Perhaps it will turn out that their language has distant relatives somewhere in the mountains of the Caucasus, or in the forgotten inscriptions of Sardinia, or in the epigraphy of ancient Iberia. Perhaps every new discovery will expand the riddle rather than close it. And this is probably the best fate for any historical mystery, not to be solved, but to be enriched. The riddle was not solved. It was expanded. What once seemed like a simple line from the Paleolithic to the present turned out to be a complex network. Intersections of migrations, cultures, languages, choices. Each new piece of data added details, but none provided a final answer. And that is exactly why the Basques remain one of the most interesting peoples in Europe. Not because they are a relic, but because they are a living reminder of how complex the reality of any human identity is. Imagine a final scene. An old man sits on a stone bench in front of his house, somewhere in the Pyrenees. The sun is setting. The valley below fills with shadow. He is saying something to his grandson, who is sitting nearby. The words he speaks are older than everything that surrounds them, older than the roads, older than the borders of states, older than any book ever written in this part of the world. The grandson listens. He does not yet know what he carries within himself. He does not know that his voice is the continuation of a chain that stretches across 70 centuries. He simply listens to his grandfather, just as his grandfather listened to his grandfather, just as that one listened to his, and so on into the depths, beyond the limits of memory. The sun sets behind the mountains. The shadows lengthen. Somewhere far away, a bell can be heard. The wind brings the smell of damp earth. And in this silence continues what began so long ago that no one remembers when. Not as an inheritance, not as a relic, but as a living present that carries within itself all previous presents, folded into one another like layers of stone in the mountains. The Basques were not what we thought, not because the old history was completely wrong, but because it was too small. The true history was bigger, older, more complex. It had more paths, more encounters, more choices. It had more human stubbornness and human fragility, more chance and more will. And perhaps that is exactly why we will never understand it to the end. Not because we lack data, but because human continuity is always somewhat more than the sum of its parts. The mountains stand, the language sounds, and someone, right now, is speaking it to a child, not knowing that they hold in their hands one of the oldest living threads of European history. As long as this thread stretches, the past has not ended. It is only waiting to be heard again.